Today we're going to talk sleep. I'll see you inside. You may have heard the term circadian rhythm before and how circadian rhythm is controlling your sleep, but what even is a circadian rhythm? So the thing that really modulates our sleepiness and our wakefulness is actually the production of specific proteins. So to take you back to biology for a second, every single one of our cells has DNA. And this DNA contains genes for pretty much any protein or organelle that needs to be produced inside of our body. And what happens is we have what are called transcription factors that bind to the DNA, transcribe a specific protein, and then this protein gets produced. But we wouldn't want to just randomly be transcribing every single protein on the DNA. There's a different expression of proteins in our head than there is in our toes, and we wouldn't want to have eyes growing on our feet. So only specific proteins get transcribed in specific locations. Additionally, even in our brain, there are specific proteins we want to have transcribed at certain times of the day to promote wakefulness. But we would actually want to turn off the production of these proteins when we're trying to go to sleep. And to be a little bit less abstract about this, proteins include things like neurotransmitters, hormones, enzymes, and other things that have functional roles inside of our body. And you may know of hormones like melatonin. We only really want melatonin during the night, but we don't really want melatonin being active during the day. And for those of you that don't know, melatonin is really the key hormone that's going to regulate all of the processes of sleep. And in a moment, I'll touch on what melatonin actually does. But you can see that we kind of want a pattern of melatonin production during the night, but suppressing melatonin production during the day. And this really is the circadian rhythm of melatonin production. And most of the proteins and enzymes inside of our body actually work on this circadian pattern. You see, the body is like this incredible efficiency machine. We will produce proteins that are involved in certain functions, and when we don't need them, we'll either turn them off or simply just break them down into their individual parts and use those parts to create new proteins. And now the circadian rhythm actually has specific genes that are involved in it that we won't really get into. But knowing this, you can kind of see how it is the expression of certain genes at certain times of day that really alters our wakefulness or our feelings of tiredness. Additionally, there are proteins that actually promote the process of sleep. And now let's say you just sat there in the same location for the entire day and watched the sun rise and sunset. Your body would actually have a natural circadian rhythm. And despite this being an extremely boring life, if you wanted to actually finely tune your body to have the perfect circadian rhythm, this is technically what you'd probably do. But I only say that because everything that we interact with in our environment actually alters what genes are being expressed. And these environmental factors are often referred to as zeitgebers, or simply just things that will alter our natural circadian rhythm, either for the positive or for the negative. So if you hear someone say that getting sunlight in the morning will fine-tune your circadian rhythm, simply what it's doing is it's increasing the expression of the natural genes that we would express if we were living in a way that is aligned with the natural circadian genetic rhythm. For example, we may actually want to have the production of cortisol directly in the morning because this will actually increase the amount of fuel available in our bloodstream. This is because cortisol will actually break down stored glucose and stored triglycerides and allow them to be released into the bloodstream so our cells, and specifically our muscles and our brain, has more energy available to start moving and get the day going. And if we get a lot of light into our eyes in the morning, it may actually slightly increase our cortisol and adrenaline levels, which can further promote the process of being awake and alert for the day. And now these are just very small, minute examples, but you can kind of see how there are patterns during the day of expression and actually inhibition of protein so that sometimes we are awake and ready to do work during the times of the day when this is needed. But our brain and our body won't be in a mode of work when we're trying to get deep, restful sleep to recover. And the biggest way our body is able to do this is by increasing or decreasing the production and activity of different proteins throughout the course of the day. With that being said, the one thing that's been constant throughout our entire evolution is the fact that there is an environment around us. So the adaptations that we have made are to respond to our external environment to change the internal milieu of what is actually being expressed. So in this way, things like darkness, temperature, simply the things and the people you are interacting with will change your gene expression. And like I said, this could be for the better or for the worse. So that being said, we can talk about a few things, or, well, I have a pretty good list of things, some of which are actually tips to promote the natural production of specific proteins that help put us in the correct state for the given time of day. And there are certain things that we may either want to remove or transition to a different time of day because they're promoting the expression of proteins that we don't really want active when we're trying to sleep or trying to be awake. And I think one of the first things that we should talk about, which is probably one of the strongest regulators of our natural circadian rhythm, is actually going to be light. With that being said, you may hear some of the things that I say today and think to yourself, well, I can't really do that. That doesn't fit inside of my lifestyle. And that's okay because the lifestyles that we live today is very different than really what our circadian patterns have evolved for. Most of these adaptations were to a life where we were living mostly outdoors during times where there weren't really schools, jobs, factories, and things like this. Instead, all our day was really about was just finding food and making sure we had shelter and then living our days out with our family without really many obligations. And reminiscing on it now, it kind of sounds pretty nice. With that being said, this really isn't feasible for most people. And nothing that I'm saying today is to make any recommendations on what you should do. All I'm trying to do is just provide you with the information so you can make an informed decision on how you want to implement this into your lifestyle. So really digging into our light environment, like I said, if we want to perfectly align our circadian rhythms, we would simply just sit there and watch the sun rise and set throughout the entire day. But since most people are actually indoors most of the day, then we can try and mimic this light environment and the different light spectrums throughout the day. So first thing in the morning, we really want as much light in our face as possible. And I know this may sound a little crazy because you hear so many people talking about blocking blue light and not getting too much light in your eye. And this actually causes some people to get a little crazy and begin wearing blue light glasses immediately in the morning. And while I think blue light glasses, as I'll touch on in a moment, are definitely beneficial if you're indoors under blue light at night, we actually want this blue light and as much light in our eyes as possible during the morning. So wearing blue light blocking glasses in the morning is actually going to make you just a little bit more tired because it's sending more of a signal that it's almost time for bed, even if you're wearing these blue light glasses right at the beginning of the day. So as I'll touch on in a moment, we can use them to align our circadian rhythm as long as we use them at the right times of day. But the most optimal thing that we would do is actually get outside and watch the sunrise in the morning. In doing so, we'll get the production and the transcription of the genes that are responsible for really making us alert for the day. And yes, these are things that you may have heard of and may have an adverse thought around, such as cortisol, adrenaline, and other very wakefulness promoting hormones and neurotransmitters. However, at the right times of day and in the right proportion, these things are necessary. The body wouldn't produce them if there wasn't some function. The issue with them is when they get extreme and we're producing cortisol right before we're trying to go to bed. And in this sense, actually seeing something that would mimic the sunrise directly before bed could keep us in a mode where we're a little bit more alert than we would like to be. So before bed, we may actually want to try and put on blue light blocking glasses. And if you want to go really in depth with it, actually using red light light bulbs, especially at night, can actually mimic the light spectrum of the setting sun. Another thing you could try, and I know this isn't feasible for some people, is actually switching from using overhead lighting to things like candles and firelight. And if you're forced to use your phone, trying to switch your phone into a red light mode. With that being said, I definitely would recommend trying to actually get off any electronics as early in the day as possible. And now one tip I have for this is a lot of times the things that we're maybe watching on YouTube don't actually require us to watch the screen, rather just listen to the audio. And while I know there's lots of discussion around 5G, we're not going to go too in-depth to this today. But simply just turning on a video that you can listen to and putting your phone in your pocket just so you're not staring at the screen, but you're still getting all the content you're looking for. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, so in the morning we're going to try and get as much sunlight and as much light into our eyes as possible. And then a good goal to have is to get your eyes in the sun as many times as possible throughout the day. And unfortunately, looking at the sun through a window, like a car window or the window of a building, isn't necessarily as good as actually getting the sunlight into your eyes. And I'm not saying to go directly and just stare at the sun, but simply getting your eyes outside, and hopefully the rest of your body as well, can help in the production of the correct hormones and proteins and neurotransmitters and all of these molecules at the right time. And the one thing that I will mention that's slightly off topic but still somewhat relevant is that actually, if your goal is to tan, you may actually be hurting your ability to tan if you are wearing sunglasses outside. And now I can't say that the data surrounding this is definitive, but there are some studies that indicate that the light in your eyes will actually increase your production of melanin, which is the pigment that makes your skin tan. So if you're outside trying to tan, but you're not getting any light in your eyes, then it may just slightly reduce your ability to tan. But like I said, we don't need to get sunlight directly in our eyes by staring at the sun. It really just seems like when our eyes are exposed to the light of the day, it will do a few different things. Specifically, it will inhibit the production of melatonin. And I think I already mentioned that melatonin is really the master hormone or neurotransmitter, however you'd like to describe it, that regulates all of the processes that occur during sleep. And it really is that light in our eyes will actually inhibit the production of melatonin. And the only way for us to produce our own natural melatonin is by shutting our eyes. And it's not necessarily actually seeing light, because the specific portion of our eyes that will signal to our brain that there is light in the environment aren't the same portions of our eyes that are actually responsible for perceiving light. What I mean by this is there are actually cells inside of our eyes called retinal ganglion cells. And these cells are not actually responsible for perceiving light, but they are responsible for sending the signal that there is light in the environment to our brain. And only specific portions of our brain that are actually responsible for producing melatonin. And the way that they figured this out was actually quite interesting. They took patients that were actually blind, and these patients didn't have the ability to perceive light, but they still had some of these cells remaining in their eye. So they were actually able to shine light in their eyes and show a drastic reduction in melatonin production, even though they didn't actually see the light themselves. Which unfortunately means that our eyes might be a little bit more sensitive to light than we realize. So trying to really block out as much light as possible before bed, and especially trying to block out as much light as possible while we're sleeping, is going to allow for the best production of melatonin. And now the things I have for sleeping are really simple. Try and make the room as pitch black as possible. Some of the things that I have recommended are to get blackout curtains, and actually to put tape over any sort of alarm clock or any sort of light in your room so that there's no light whatsoever. And another benefit of putting tape over your alarm clock is that if you wake up in the middle of the night and look at what time it is, this could definitely cause you to build up a little bit of anxiety. Or just anger that you have to wake up in 2 hours and go do something that maybe you don't want to do. I definitely felt this during high school. But I did actually find that simply unplugging my alarm clock, which displayed the time on the screen, and using my phone as an alarm clock so I never actually knew what time it was when I woke up in the middle of the night, actually did improve my sleep quality. And this will lead me into my next point, which is phones, but finishing up on light, simply just making sure that there's absolutely no light in your room whatsoever would be the best protocol. Another thing that could be really helpful is actually wearing an eye mask. And I know when you think of eye masks, you may think of those ladies in the movies that are extremely rich and wake up with a pink, fluffy eye mask on. But they certainly are on the right track, and it seems like they're prioritizing their sleep a little bit better than some of us. But putting something over your eyes, specifically an eye mask, because it's very lightweight and doesn't really annoy you at all during the night, can help just reassure that no light is getting into our eyes that would wake us up or reduce our melatonin production, which would reduce our sleep quality. And I did actually kind of find a trick that allows me to wake up almost without an alarm clock. So certainly making sure the room is pitch black and wearing an eye mask while I'm trying to go to bed. However, if I wake up in the middle of the night, because everyone in my house is asleep and all the lights are off, there really is no risk to exposing my eyes to blue light. And because it's dark outside, I'll actually open up my windows. But once again, this really has no effect on the light environment because there really is no light anywhere in the environment. However, when the sun does begin to rise, the light will shine through the window. And this light shining on your face can actually help you naturally wake up. And now, if the sun is rising at 5 o'clock and the normal time that you wake up to get 8 hours of sleep is 7 o'clock, then this may not be something that you want to do. And personally, this doesn't always work for me because I actually typically get up before the sun rises. But if your circadian patterns really are aligned to the rising of the sun, you can use the sun rising through the window to actually naturally wake yourself up without an alarm clock. And I actually have a few other tips for how to do this, but I want to finish on the light topic first. So really, the other big source of light that we would want to try and mitigate is actually screen light before we go to bed. So even if you're wearing blue light blocking glasses, a very bright screen like one you may see in the television could definitely still impair your melatonin production and your circadian rhythms in general. So once again, I would try to actually switch to things like audiobooks, podcasts, or just listening to YouTube videos, at least right before you're going to bed. And the same actually goes for doing things prior to bed where you're in a building with a lot of overhead light. And I can really just imagine all of the scenarios where this can occur, and people don't really want to give this up. This would be things like parties or maybe going to the gym right before you go to bed. But remember, you don't have to do any of this. These are simply just tips that would technically help to align your circadian rhythm a little bit better. Optimally, you wouldn't be using any screen light or artificial light whatsoever. But once again, this really isn't optimal for anyone. And while I'm on the topic of phones and television, one thing that most people don't think about is the actual content that they're seeing on these devices. People don't realize, but the things that we're viewing actually will change our hormones and neurotransmitters. For example, if you're watching a scary movie, your adrenaline may go up, and so will your cortisol. And now this isn't enough to invoke any of the detrimental things that people talk about with these neuromodulators, but it definitely has the ability to make you more alert and awake. And if you're doing this directly before you go to bed, it can actually make your mind a little bit more active prior to bed. And in this case, the signal for wakefulness may actually be a little bit more dominant than we would like to optimally get into deep sleep. And the other thing I'll mention is something like social media. We don't get to choose, for the most part, what we actually see on social media. So we may accidentally or even unpurposely view things that really grab our attention and make us a little bit more alert and aware. And just like TV, if we do this directly before bed, it could impact our sleep. And this isn't just technically for phones and social media. If you have a very alerting and maybe even slightly agitating conversation before bed, then once again it could impede your sleep. You may actually be left ruminating on it, trying to go to bed, and this will impact your ability to fall asleep when you get into bed. So it sounds crazy, but really trying to be almost as monk-like as possible before bed would technically promote the best sleep. And now there's so much to cover in the topic of light, but I want to move on to temperature. And I should be able to knock this one out a little bit quicker, but we want to mimic the natural rise and fall of the temperature throughout the day. And one great way to do this is simply by going to the weather app. and finding the rise and fall of the temperature and trying to mimic that in whatever environment you're in. But in a scenario where you may not be going to sleep at the same time the sun is setting, what we want to do is actually allow for a temperature rise throughout the day, and then right before bed, maybe 2 to 3 hours, have the temperature begin to lower, and then throughout sleep, the best temperature is going to be between 63 and 68 degrees. And then when we are going to wake up, we're actually going to want the temperature to elevate. And now, I don't know if everyone has the ability to do this, but luckily the thermostat that came in our house actually permits you the ability to change and set the temperature for specific portions of the day. So you can actually set the temperature to be in the 70s or whatever feels comfortable during the day. And then about an hour before bed, just so you don't get too cold, set it so that the temperature drops to whatever your optimal sleeping temperature is. And then set it to begin rising once again about an hour before waking. And this is my second tip for actually waking up without an alarm clock. This rise in temperature can set the circadian pattern so it's a little bit easier to transition between sleep and wakefulness. So recapping this, if you have the ability to set your thermostat or even manually do it, choose an optimal sleeping temperature and try and set the thermostat to make the house this specific temperature, starting about an hour before you go to bed all the way until between 45 minutes and an hour before you wake up. And then set the thermostat to actually raise the temperature within this 45-minute to an hour period and keep this temperature consistent throughout the waking day. So we've touched on sight and temperature, and the next thing I think I'll touch on is sound. Once again, this one's quite simple, but the more sound we hear, the more stimuli our brain is forced to process, and the more likely we will be to wake up. And even if we don't wake up, it may fragment our sleep and decrease the depth of our sleep. And some of the noises that we don't really think about are simply just cars that drive by during the night. And one habit that people get into as a child is actually going to bed with television on. And this definitely has some impacts on your quality of sleep if you don't have anything blocking out the noise or the light of the television. If we're going to be, once again, optimal, the television has no reason to actually be in the bedroom. And in this sense, neither would your phone, but if you're like me and you use it as an alarm clock, then it does make sense to have it in your room. However, if you wake up in the middle of the night and for some reason you feel the urge to get on your phone, then maybe you should put your phone in a different area of the house and make sure that you never get up in the middle of the night and play on your phone. Now, I will have a few more tips for what you can do if you get up in the middle of the night, but let's stick on the topic of sound for a moment. Really, the only thing you can do for sound is putting something in your ears so that there's a continuous sound throughout the entire night. Personally, I really enjoy earplugs, but they have shown that pink noise does seem to have a little bit of efficacy for promoting deeper, more quality sleep. And this is just something that you can find on the internet. With that being said, while I'm not an expert on the topic, so I can't give you much information on this, the idea of having some sort of electrical internet signal that is really close to your head at night definitely doesn't look like it's going to be the best thing for sleep. So unless you're playing this white noise on some sort of speakers, then your best bet is likely going to be wearing earplugs. And one thing that I've found to help is actually having a fan next to me that not only keeps me cool throughout the night, but has one continuous sound from the propellers that acts very similar to white or pink noise. And I'm not sure why they named it white and pink, but it's just what it's named. And if you know the answer to this, I would love someone to leave it in the comments or directly message me. So really trying to block noise, especially while we're sleeping, is going to be beneficial. So in terms of all of these environmental factors, it really is, for lack of a better term, trying to make the room a cave. Dark, quiet, and cold. However, this really is going to promote the best sleep, and then trying to implement some of the things leading up to sleep could also help. And I know I keep talking about all of this evolutionary stuff, and the next thing that I want to mention may not sound very contextual in the grand scheme of things, but when I explain it, I think I will make a little bit more sense. What I'm talking about is actually putting a piece of tape over your mouth. This is called mouth taping, and it's actually been shown to be a pretty efficacious way to actually improve sleep quality, and this is because it forces you to breathe through your nose throughout the night. And I'll explain why this is beneficial in a moment, but if we simply look back at the facial structures and the alignment of the faces of our ancestors, it does look like they weren't what you would call today as a mouth breather. And it also seems like they simply just had better structural alignment for promoting better breathing, specifically nasal breathing, which is breathing through your nose. And I think the best resource on this is someone named James Nestor. And he actually did an experiment where he went a week, I believe, where he actually shut his nostrils and was forced to breathe through his nose and saw very, very drastic declines in the depth and the quality of his sleep, and really just his energy and quality of life in general. And unfortunately, we can't really control how we breathe during the night, so if we naturally breathe through our nose, then we'll be more inclined to breathe through our nose during the night. But if you notice that you breathe through your mouth throughout most of the day, you're likely going to be breathing through your mouth throughout the night. And one of the biggest reasons that this is so harmful is you actually blow off less CO2 when you're breathing through your mouth, meaning more carbon dioxide will actually accumulate. And as anyone who's tried to hold their breath for any period of time understands, that when this carbon dioxide begins to accumulate because you're not blowing out any carbon dioxide, you begin to feel extreme anxiety and you become very alert. And this absolutely is counterproductive if our goal is deep sleep. And now, as long as you have a clear and open nasal passage, humans appear to be much better at actually warming and detoxifying the air that we breathe in through our nose, and breathing off more CO2 when we breathe out through our nose. Given that you have the ability to breathe through your nose, it will promote much deeper and much better breathing through the night. And this is where the idea of putting tape over your mouth to simply keep your mouth closed so you don't revert back to breathing through your mouth has been shown to be extremely helpful. Additionally, a lot of people deal with what's called sleep apnea. And this is actually when your airways, specifically your mouth, gets blocked by something in your airways during the night, and you simply stop breathing for a moment and wake yourself up. And the problem is oftentimes we don't even notice this, so you could have sleep apnea and not even realize, but the detriment to your sleep caused by sleep apnea is certainly noticeable in energy and health. So maybe that you wake up in the morning and you simply don't feel energized, and you realize that despite doing a lot of effort and feeling like you're doing everything correct during your waking hours, you're really not getting to your health goals. One of the reasons could actually be what's called undiagnosed sleep apnea, where you have sleep apnea, which is very detrimental to your sleep quality and overall quality of life, but you don't actually realize it because, once again, it's occurring in your sleep. And one of the best ways to actually know is twofold. One, you could actually record yourself during the night. And if you listen back to the audio and you hear a lot of noises, these aren't normal, and you may want to actually talk to your doctor about getting a sleep study done. And the other would be if you sleep with a partner, if they mention that you make a lot of noise during the night and maybe you snore a lot during the night, then it's very likely that your breathing is inhibiting your quality of sleep. And once again, this would be something that you simply talk to your doctor about getting a sleep study done, and they may actually prescribe you a sleep apnea machine. But another way to actually try and combat this is simply by putting tape over your mouth. And the other is actually losing weight. So, as crazy as it may sound, we actually get what's referred to as a fatty tongue. When we begin to put on fat, this fat is deposited everywhere around our body. And now it's mostly deposited around our abdomen and lower back, but sometimes it's deposited in areas that we don't necessarily want it to be, like our organs and our tongue. And this can actually increase the size of our tongue and simply make it heavier and more likely to fall back into our throat during the night and clog our airways. And another thing is simply just having more tissue around your breathing passages, such as having a larger neck. Both of these don't necessarily mean that you have sleep apnea, but they could contribute to the onset of sleep apnea. So once again, this is something that you'd want to get checked by your doctor, and if this is a result of being unhealthy and having excess body weight, then you may actually find that if you begin to lose weight, your sleep quality improves. And with that out of the way, I think I covered all of the big environmental factors. And now obviously there's a whole lot more that I may have missed, But there are a few other things that I want to mention, and these are really in terms of supplements and things that you would do leading up to bed. So obviously, as I mentioned, trying to keep off your phone as much as possible prior to bed and all other electronics. One thing that is kind of underrepresented a lot of times is what's the first thing that you do immediately upon waking? If the first thing you do is grab your phone and begin scrolling social media, and oftentimes this leads you to find something that may not necessarily be something that you really wanted to view. For example, something that is kind of depressing or kind of makes you a little bit upset. You will definitely remember this, and that following night and most of the nights following that, when you're going to bed, one of the top things on your mind is going to be what you are going to do first thing in the morning. And if you have this association that the first thing you're going to do is something that has the potential to aggravate you, it could build a little bit of anxiety prior to bed. And you may not actually be conscious of any of this, and I know it may not sound all that big, but any little thing that promotes wakefulness, such as thinking about what you are going to do, or even having some slight anxiety about what you're going to do the next day, is very likely going to impede your sleep quality. And you may have noticed this on bigger scales, such as having a test the very next day. You may even wake up before your alarm clock because you are nervous and kind of excited, depending on the kind of person you are, about what's upcoming the next day. And because of this, your mind doesn't completely relax during sleep to get into the deepest stages, and you may think about the next day a little bit during sleep, which just reduces the depth of your sleep just slightly. So personally, I've implemented a routine that I do in the morning, and I actually leave my phone for about 30 minutes. When I wake up in the morning, I have a specific thing that I do every day, so I don't have to think about it before I go to bed. And what I do is simply make my food for the day. So not only do I knock out this task, so not only does this give me a little bit of time in the morning to wake up, but it also gives me something that I kind of look forward to in the morning. And since I know exactly what I'm going to do and how I'm going to do it, there's no need to think about it the night prior. And then once that's finished, I will check my phone and respond to anything that I need to respond to. And once again, I'm not saying that you have to do any of this. This is just telling you what I'm doing. With that being said, the next topic that I really want to touch on is actually things like food, supplements, and water. So you may understand that this affects your quality of life a lot, but it can also affect your sleep, even on a very acute term. And the first thing that I actually want to touch on is probably the most commonly used supplement for sleep, which is melatonin. And while having melatonin is good, a natural production, pattern, and abundance of melatonin is what's going to give you optimal sleep most likely. And now some people do have an impaired ability to produce melatonin due to genetic or dietary factors. And this is something that you may want to talk to your doctor or just get checked to see what your status is. However, most people have good melatonin production as long as they're doing everything correctly. And while it's not necessarily true that a melatonin supplement will reduce your natural production of melatonin, but it does have a few effects that may alter the pattern that will naturally allow you to be awake and alert during the day and asleep during the night. So there are two different types of melatonin supplements. The first is an instant release and the other is a time release. The instant release will get into your system very quickly, but it's also metabolized fairly quickly. So you may actually metabolize the melatonin in the middle of the night, and this could cause you to wake up. And in terms of the time release melatonin, this is something that actually takes a little bit longer to be metabolized. But in doing so, you actually put yourself at the risk of still having some leftover melatonin in your system in the morning, which could cause you to feel groggy and kind of sluggish in the morning, and even throughout the entire day. So trying to supplement your natural melatonin is going to lead to a lot of errors that really wouldn't be natural to your normal production. But once again, to normally produce melatonin, we simply just have to remove blue light from our eyes. And really as much light as possible for that matter. But there's one other thing dietarily that could help. And I've talked about this before, but this is the consumption of tryptophan. So inside the brain, to make melatonin, we turn tryptophan into serotonin, and then turn serotonin into melatonin. And tryptophan is an amino acid that isn't only used inside of the brain, so when we eat tryptophan, it doesn't go directly into the brain. Additionally, surrounding our brain, we have what's referred to as a blood-brain barrier. And this is a membrane that actually keeps molecules in our bloodstream out of our brain and only allows certain molecules in that we can use inside the brain. And this is extremely helpful for basically preventing brain damage. And for tryptophan to get into the brain, it has to go through an amino acid transporter. However, this transporter transports many different amino acids, and it will simply uptake whatever is in our bloodstream. So in a sense, tryptophan has a little bit of competition for getting in the brain. Think of yourself as being tryptophan, and think of a fire drill. If there's only one door, only so many people can go in at a time, and you may get stuck and not be able to get out that door for some period of time. And with that being said, since our blood is constantly circulating, you only have so many chances to be present at the site of this blood-brain barrier and get into the brain. And if there are a lot of other amino acids there, you're that much less likely to have an open passage into the brain or out the door to escape the fire. So having a lot of tryptophan in the blood does make it more likely that tryptophan will get into the brain. However, what makes it just as likely is if we have less of the competing amino acids in the bloodstream. And now I go more in depth to this in the episode specifically on this, and that's episode 35 called Is Low Carb Killing Your Sleep? And the reason it's titled that is because in order to get amino acids out of the bloodstream, we use insulin to upregulate amino acid uptake. And the way that we increase insulin is by having elevated blood glucose levels. And we can achieve this by either eating carbohydrates or eating an abundance of protein. And this is because the protein can actually be converted into glucose inside the liver. And then this will subsequently raise our blood glucose and raise our production of insulin. And I want to give credits for this theory to Chris Masterjohn. And I had a great interview with him. And that would be episode 51. But coming back to getting tryptophan into the brain, if we eat a lot of protein to increase our blood glucose, we'll also be getting a lot of amino acids. Meaning that even if we have this insulin rise that helps facilitate getting amino acids into the muscles and other tissues, there's simply just more in our blood in the first place, so there still might be more left over that can compete for tryptophan to get into the brain. However, if we increase insulin production through carbohydrates, then we don't need to ingest additional amino acids, so there will be less amino acids. So there will be less amino acids inside of our bloodstream, and this rise in insulin can clear our bloodstream of amino acids much better. And the amazing thing is that tryptophan does not seem to be directed towards the muscle via insulin. So there will be tryptophan still in the bloodstream left over to get inside of the brain. And it doesn't really seem like it matters when this occurs, as long as it occurs once throughout the day, because the body will turn it into serotonin and then melatonin whenever it needs it. And once again, this will occur when we have no light shining on our eye. But since tryptophan is metabolized and cleared fairly quickly, we would want to do this every single day in some form or fashion. And we can do this in two different ways. The first would actually be simply just taking a tryptophan supplement on an empty stomach. And the best time to do this would be in the morning when we don't have an abundance of amino acids inside of our bloodstream. And the other way we could do this is by eating some sort of protein that is very rich in tryptophan along with some sort of carbohydrate. And the best sources of tryptophan include beef, fish, poultry, and actually milk. And if you really wanted to, simply just drinking the glass of milk on its own would work to both increase tryptophan and increase insulin. But if you are trying to lose weight and you're struggling with appetite, this may not be the best way to satiate your appetite. But I talk very in depth about this subject on episode 56, titled How to Manage Your Appetite. With that being said, one of the best ways to get tryptophan into the brain, once again, is going to be pairing a protein that is rich in tryptophan, along with some sort of elevation in blood glucose coming from either dietary carbohydrates or, if you feel necessary, dietary protein, which can help get tryptophan into the brain to be converted into melatonin. And now there's one last supplement that I'll mention that is the only supplement that I actually use for sleep, and this would be magnesium bisglycinate. And the reason I choose magnesium glycinate over other forms of magnesium is that glycine is actually a neurotransmitter in and of itself, and it works very similar to GABA, which is the relaxing or inhibitory neurotransmitter. And luckily enough, magnesium also increases GABA signaling within the brain. So both of these effects act to relax the brain at night by simply inhibiting some of the connections from firing during the night, which we may not want to be activated. And I certainly have found that using this supplement has improved both deep sleep and quality of sleep. So sticking with nutrition, one thing that's really important is blood glucose. One of the reasons we may wake up in the middle of the night is because our blood glucose levels begin to decline. And really, most people should have fairly good internal control of their blood glucose simply through the production of glucose by their liver. However, a lot of times when we're eating a lot of carbohydrates very frequently, our body's ability to maintain a stable blood glucose is altered, and this is why chronic consumption of carbohydrates could lead to something like diabetes, which is extreme ups and downs in one's blood glucose. And as most diabetics will tell you, they are constantly trying to manage their blood glucose through food. And when they go long periods of time without eating, they begin to get very low on blood glucose. And this causes kind of dizziness and feelings of slight anxiety. But one other thing it will do is actually wake us up during sleep. And since we can't really eat during sleep, or we certainly should not be, if we are on this blood glucose roller coaster, it is very likely to wake us up in the middle of the night due to hunger and low blood glucose, meaning low energy in the brain. So there certainly are a bunch of different strategies, and I think the most important one is simply just trying to maintain proper insulin sensitivity. And to do this, we certainly want to have periods of either the day or the week in which we're not necessarily eating a large amount of carbohydrates. The best recommendation I can give you is simply putting your carbohydrates around your workout, and then simply replacing these carbohydrates with fat during the other meals of the day, and certainly ensuring that you're getting protein at every single meal. And the most important time would be in the meals 3 to 6 hours before bed. And this is a recommendation for someone who is struggling with waking up in the middle of the night feeling hungry. I would actually try and switch the carbohydrates in your last meal of the day for a fat. And this is because a meal containing protein and fat likely will not increase your blood glucose levels all that much. And as a result, you won't get as great of an insulin spike. And this means that you're less likely to have reactive hypoglycemia, where you produce too much insulin and you actually lower your blood glucose levels too much, and this will cause you to get low blood sugar during the night. And if I confused anyone on accident, blood sugar and blood glucose can be used interchangeably. So luckily, most people's livers are extremely good at maintaining stable blood glucose, especially on a lower carbohydrate diet. But this isn't feasible for everyone, so the only recommendation would be trying to go lower carbohydrate before bed. Simply when we eat carbohydrates, we basically manually change our blood glucose levels. And the body will produce hormones to adapt to this and lower blood glucose, but it can't always secrete the perfect amount of insulin and other hormones. Well, mainly insulin. So as a result, we may actually have a little bit too much insulin and bring our blood glucose down a little bit too much. And once again, if this occurs during the night, then it certainly could cause us to wake up in the middle of the night feeling hungry. However, if we allow our blood glucose to stabilize before bed, then the liver and pancreas will work in tandem to really maintain this blood glucose level at a very stable level throughout the night and make sure that the brain has all of the glucose it needs throughout the entire night. And if I forgot to mention why this blood glucose is so important, this is because the brain, unless you are in a state of ketosis, will use almost entirely carbohydrate for energy. And I say carbohydrate and not glucose because it can actually use lactate. And I hope to do an entire episode on this because this research that is emerging about the functional role of lactate in the brain is really, really interesting. But all that really matters for this discussion is that Glucose is the fuel used by the brain during sleep, unless you are in ketosis. And anytime blood glucose gets low, the brain will actually increase production of cortisol and adrenaline. And this works to go around the body liberating fatty acids, glucose, and amino acids to turn into fuel. But unfortunately, it also decreases our sleep depth and makes it more likely for us to wake up. But once again, if we have a stable blood glucose going to sleep, the liver and the pancreas does a great job of maintaining this level throughout the entire night and ensuring that blood glucose never gets all too low. So that tangent out of the way, I guess the last thing that I'll say is that protein intake prior to bed could either be helpful or hurtful depending on your goal. So I'm going to frame this in the context of maximizing longevity or maximizing performance and muscle growth. While it is extremely important to have an abundance of muscle as we get older, fasting and caloric restriction has been shown to actually increase lifespan. And this is because when we eat protein, the amino acids will stimulate a molecule called mTOR. And mTOR is responsible for growth and proliferation, which is great if we're trying to increase athletic performance and specifically maintain as much muscle mass as possible. But mTOR will actually inhibit a protein called AMPK, and both of these proteins are found inside of our cells. So mTOR is responsible for protein synthesis and anabolism, and AMPK is responsible for a process called autophagy. And this is actually a cellular recycling process that takes damaged or misfolded proteins, chops them up into their individual amino acids, and simply just reuses these amino acids to make healthier proteins and organelles. And the reason why AMPK is so helpful for longevity is simply because it allows us to recycle damaged or unuseful proteins and organelles. Therefore, they won't begin to accumulate inside of the cell and inhibit the cell from maximal function. And it also is important for the process of cellular repair. So through fasting and through exercise, we will get this AMPK upregulated because we won't have an abundance of amino acids and other macromolecules like glucose and fatty acids inside of the bloodstream. And in doing so, we stop the stimulation of mTOR and allow for AMPK to become activated. And then we go through this recycling and repair process. And this is one of the benefits of fasting. And overnight is one of our biggest opportunities for a fast. And in terms of upregulating this AMPK and longevity process, taking advantage of this by actually not having a large meal prior to bed. And unfortunately, it seems that stopping any food 3 hours to bed seems to be the best for health and longevity. And once again, this isn't feasible for everyone, but it's simply just what the data seems to suggest. But in doing so, this also means that there will be a long period of time in which we don't have amino acids inside of our system. So we have to accept that for a period of time, we will actually downregulate protein synthesis and upregulate protein degradation. So if you're trying to put on the maximal amount of muscle possible, you may actually want to try and eat a large dose of protein right before going to bed, so you simply have a steady flow of amino acids all day long. And on top of this, you would eat protein immediately upon waking and in meals spread evenly throughout the day, so you always have an abundance of amino acids. But once again, in doing so, you're telling yourself that you are not prioritizing this cellular recycling and cellular cleaning process that is facilitated by low availability of amino acids. So you get to make the choice. If you want to prioritize muscle growth as much as possible, actually a solid amount of protein before bed can allow for the most amino acids available. And you can even enhance this by an additional leucine supplement, because leucine is going to help stimulate this mTOR molecule. And now a large dose of protein, such as 40 grams of high-quality protein like fish, beef, or chicken, is going to give you all of the leucine that you need. But if you are eating a lower quality protein, such as a plant-based protein that may not be rich in leucine, taking a leucine supplement could help maximally upregulate this mTOR molecule. And as long as you have enough protein available, you will maximally stimulate protein synthesis. So given the lower carbohydrate approach I mentioned, it looks like a nice steak right before bed might be your best bet. But remember, this is for someone trying to maximize every ounce of muscle growth. Conversely, if we're looking to lean in a little bit more to the benefits of fasting for health and lifespan, then we may actually want to use this period before bed to prolong our fast just slightly. So in this scenario, you actually just would stop eating between 2 and 3 hours before bed. However, remember that if hunger impedes your sleep, that the reduction in sleep is going to be much more longevity decrease than any benefit that you may get from extending your fast just a little bit. Sleep really is one of the biggest drivers for any sort of repair and longevity. And that's why I've been talking about it for the last 52 minutes. And don't worry, we are almost done. So I covered food, and the last two things on nutrition that I'll cover are going to be electrolytes and water. So oftentimes people get up in the middle of the night to use the restroom. And this isn't something that we should actually have happen. You see, there's a specific hormone that we produce called anti-diuretic hormone that is actually supposed to keep us from going to the bathroom during the night by reabsorbing water from our kidneys and not allowing our bladder to fill up. However, a lot of the things that we do actually throw off this balance, and a lot of people are told to drink a large amount of water. And in essence, even though we are reabsorbing some of this water, we simply are intaking so much water that the bladder still begins to fill during the night. There are two tricks that I have found for this. The first one is actually decreasing the amount of water that you consume prior to bed. And you don't necessarily have to decrease the amount of water that you're drinking, but simply shifting 60 to 70% of your water in the first half of the day and drinking the remaining 30 to 40% in the latter half of the day means that you'll be drinking less water right before bed. And especially trying to simply just drink as little water as you need to stay hydrated in the hour to 2 hours leading up to bed. That doesn't mean completely abstain from water, but be mindful of not drinking a liter of water the hour before bed. And the other thing that is helpful is actually managing your salt and potassium in the meal prior to bed. So salt will allow the kidneys to retain more water and increase production of anti-diuretic hormone. And potassium will actually allow the kidneys to release sodium, therefore releasing more water, therefore filling up our bladder just a little bit faster. So actually having the meal prior to bed be a little bit richer in salt and not extremely abundant in potassium, something like a steak, could allow you to retain a little bit more water during the night. And now this may actually cause you to have a little bit more water in the morning, so you'll have to play around with this to find what's optimal for you. But for most people, something like a fourth of a teaspoon of salt prior to bed, and then whatever salt that you use on your last meal should help you retain a little bit more water and not have to wake up to use the restroom. Alright, with that out of the way, I've done entire episodes and series about this last topic, which is going to be caffeine, so I'll try and make this one quick. We can actually use caffeine in the morning to increase our natural circadian rhythm because it acts very similar to how our body would behave. But not first thing in the morning because we actually have what's called a dawn phenomenon, which is basically a natural cup of coffee that we get every morning. And this is because we have an upregulation in cortisol, adrenaline, and blood glucose. And these are all of the effects that occur during coffee. So actually, pushing your coffee off between an hour and 2 hours after waking. This allows you to reduce the amount of caffeine you're consuming first thing in the morning and makes that initial dose of caffeine last a little bit longer, making it less likely that you'll need another dose later in the day. But with that being said, we do want to push it off for about an hour or two, but we want to stop any sort of caffeine intake as early as possible. The best recommendation I can give is no later than 10 hours before you plan to go to bed. But some people are slow or fast metabolizers, meaning some people may need to restrict coffee altogether because they simply don't metabolize it quick enough to clear it out of their system by the time they want to go to bed. And others may metabolize it extremely quickly. So they may be okay having a second cup of caffeine. And I know everyone wants to think that they're a fast metabolizer, but most people are not. So no matter if you are a fast metabolizer or not, trying to restrict caffeine 10 hours before you plan to go to bed is probably going to make sure that it's not impeding your sleep. And yes, you can get to sleep even after having a cup of coffee prior to bed. But it is the depth and the quality of your sleep that will be impacted, meaning you'll wake up in the morning more tired and you'll probably end up consuming more caffeine the following day. And the last subject I'll touch on is actually exercise. So we have a molecule in our brain called adenosine, and it's responsible for this sleep pressure that we feel. And this is what caffeine blocks. And the way the body naturally makes adenosine is by degrading ATP, which is the energy currency of our entire body. So the more energy we're using in a given day, the more ATP we will produce. So exercise can increase the adenosine production we have and give us the beneficial sense of fatigue at the end of the day that promotes sleep. Additionally, we want adenosine inside of the brain, so making sure that we're actually doing some sort of cognitively demanding thing during the day. And now, I can't say this will make a substantial impact, but after a hard day of cognitively demanding tasks, you probably will feel a little bit more tired. And once again, this is probably the accumulation of adenosine, so you'll have much deeper sleep that night. And the only issue we run in with adenosine is if we are overworking, then we may not clear it all out during the time that we have to sleep. Adenosine is cleared out during sleep, but if you accumulate so much from doing an extreme amount of work, such as physical or mental work, you simply may not even get enough sleep to clear all the adenosine out. So you'll wake up in the morning with a little bit left over, so you may feel a little tired in the morning. And this is a great sign that you may be doing a little bit too much and overworking yourself just slightly. And you can determine this by looking at a fitness tracker. If you are still getting extremely high quality sleep, but you still feel tired in the morning, you may quite literally be accumulating too much fatigue during the day that you simply can't recover from it with the amount of time you're spending in bed. So you have two choices. The first one is to sleep more, or you may have to slow down just slightly. But most people really do not fall into the risk category for this. So don't use this as an excuse to do less work. With that being said, we're about at the 60-minute mark, so I think I'm going to end this one here. I could talk about sleep all day long, so if you have any other questions or other topics you think I should touch on, please feel free to reach out to me at Calvin_Scheller or at any of the links in the description. So, I hope you enjoyed, and thank you for listening. Have a great day.